So remember, autonomous consumption still has these three subcomponents: wealth, expected future income, and consumer confidence. Increase any one of those, and our IS curve is going to shift to the right. Notice I'm using arrows. You can use arrows too, and mnemonics, in a bullet point format, managing your time carefully. Okay, autonomous investment. Right? Remember, autonomous investment includes changes in business confidence, expected future profits or cash flow, changes in technology. Improvements or increases in any of those are also going to cause the IS curve to shift to the right. So one easy way to remember these things when we think about any of these shifts on the IS curve, suppose the interest rate doesn't change. What do we think would happen to overall spending? Right? Remember, spending is the same thing as economic output. So if the interest rate doesn't change and consumers spend more, guess what? Economic output has to go up. Or if businesses spend more, economic output has to go up. So the IS curve is going to shift to the right. Okay, net exports. We got a little bit of a difference here with autonomous net exports. Right? So if autonomous net exports increase, the IS curve shifts to the right. But autonomous net exports also have these three things inside of it that we talked about. Foreign preferences for domestic goods. Increase that. We're also going to increase exports, which will increase net exports. Domestic preferences for foreign goods. This is just the opposite, right? If we demand more foreign goods, then our imports will go up. The IS curve will shift to the left. And finally, foreign trade barriers. If there are more foreign trade barriers, then we would have fewer exports. Net exports would go down. IS curve would shift to the left. Yes, it would. I didn't put that in there. Because the reason I didn't, so the question was, wouldn't foreign income also be in here? I didn't put it in here because that's not something that we put directly into autonomous net exports. I also didn't put it in where it should be, but that's your fault. Okay, so we could say the same thing. Autonomous government purchases, right? Increase those, IS curve shifts to the right. How about autonomous taxes? Ooh, taxes. Taxes go up, less disposable income, consumer spending goes down, IS curve shifts to the left. Here's where, is it there? Oh, no, here's where I should put that. Okay, two other variables, autonomous financial frictions. Now remember, financial frictions tell us about the difference between the real interest rate that the central bank sets, right? That's our MP curve, the real interest rate on the vertical axis of our MP curve. By the way, that's exactly the same real interest rate that's on the IS diagram. But when we have financial frictions, there's a difference between what's happening to the real interest rate the central bank sets and the real interest rate that businesses borrow at. So we have to know, is that increasing or decreasing? Right? If it increases, then it also is suggesting that the IS curve will move to the left. Bigger financial frictions, less borrowing. Less borrowing means less spending, even if the central bank real interest rate has not changed. Same with the exchange rate. Now, at this point, we're keeping the real exchange rate as an autonomous variable. I realize in the book, when they talk about this, that it talks about the real interest rate. There's method to my madness here. There's a reason why we want to separate the exchange rate from the real interest rate. So net exports are going to depend upon the real exchange rate. For now, it will be an exogenous variable. We will change it later in a couple of weeks when we talk about exchange rates in international trade. And here's where I left off autonomous, just to show you how bad my handwriting is. Autonomous foreign economic output. Okay, so that's YF. And if that increases, the IS curve will shift to the right. If the foreign economy gets bigger, they will buy more goods and services. Some of those goods and services will be foreign, so their imports will go up. Their imports are our exports. So our exports would rise, in which case the IS curve would move to the right. Okay? Now notice there's a lot in that IS curve. So remember, all of these variables, consumption function, our investment function, government purchases function, financial frictions, all of that, they're all buried inside that IS curve. Okay? The only thing that's not buried inside that curve is the real interest rate and real output. Everything else is inside. Okay? Now, the second curve that we have is our monetary policy curve. Right? This tells us what the central bank is doing. In the monetary policy curve, the positive relationship between the real interest rate and the inflation rate. And again, this is the real interest rate that the central bank sets. And again, the steepness of the monetary policy curve reflects how sensitive the real interest rate is to changes in inflation. If the central bank becomes more sensitive to changes in inflation, the monetary policy curve will become steeper. Now, compared to the IS curve, the monetary policy curve is a breeze. Right? The only thing that we have to worry about is the central bank going to change its autonomous monetary policy, our R bar term. That's the only thing that causes the monetary policy curve to shift. Increase R bar, and now the monetary policy curve shifts to the left, or it shifts up. Or. Okay, aggregate demand curve. Now, because the aggregate demand curve is built from the IS curve and the monetary policy curve, it's got a lot of complexity to it as well. But again, it's the inverse relationship between inflation and economic output. And again, this steepness shows us how sensitive economic output is to changes in inflation, which also cause changes in the real interest rate. Remember, it's going to be the change in the real interest rate that's going to tell us how much economic output is changing. The whole reason for the inverse relationship, higher inflation, leads to a higher real interest rate. And that's what reduces real economic output. Okay, what causes the aggregate demand curve to shift? Well, here are four spending variables: consumption, investment, net exports, and government purchases, right? All of our autonomous spending. Increases in any of those shift the AD curve to the right. Here are some of our other issues: autonomous taxes, autonomous financial frictions, the autonomous real exchange rate. Increases in any of those would shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And again, I should put in here autonomous foreign income. And in this case, an increase will lead to a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. And also, monetary policy can shift the aggregate demand curve as well. So just keep those two in mind. Long-run aggregate supply curve is pretty straightforward. It's a vertical relationship between inflation and economic output at potential. It reflects the classical dichotomy, or the potential output is independent of inflation. And as we've seen, changes in the labor supply, capital stock, total factor productivity, or the natural rate of unemployment can all cause shifts in the long-run aggregate supply curve. Increase labor supply, capital stock, total factor productivity, potential output goes up. Long-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the right. If the natural rate of unemployment goes up, it tells us the efficiency with which the labor market is matching job seekers with job openings has gone down. So potential output will actually fall and will shift to, whoops, I don't want to put that there. Will shift to the left. And finally, our short-run aggregate supply curve. Again, a positive relationship. Okay. Positive relationship between inflation and economic output. Right? Positive relationship. As you increase economic output, inflation rises. For a given expected inflation. Remember, you cannot draw a short-run aggregate supply curve without knowing what expected inflation is. We are continuing to use, and will for another couple of weeks, adaptive expectations for inflation expectations. So we're not going to change anything that we've done. The steepness of the short-run aggregate supply curve reflects how flexible or sticky wages and prices are. The more flexible, the steeper the short-run aggregate supply curve. We really only have two variables that change, that cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. Changes in inflation expectations and price shocks. Now, changes in inflation expectations can come about for two different reasons. One is there can be a direct change in inflation expectations. Right? They change for some reason. The second is there could be an output gap of positive or negative. Right? And the output gap means that actual inflation and expected inflation would be different. And with a one-year lag, that causes expected inflation to change and the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift. So notice here I didn't add output gaps as an independent cause because the output gap actually leads back to a change in expected inflation. But expected inflation can change either directly or with a lag because of an output gap. Now, when we work with this model, which may be a multiple choice question, it will definitely be an analytical question. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Read the question carefully, right? Make sure you know where we're starting from. Where's the initial equilibrium? Are there any special assumptions that are being made, which might have to do with the steepness of the short-run aggregate supply curve, or the aggregate demand curve, or the size of the shifts, or any of those things that are being identified? What shocks happen? Right? Those are the things that you want to make sure that you can see and identify when you start to answer a question. Now, once you've done that, the first thing you want to do is, are we in general equilibrium? Because if we are, then you know the next thing has to be a shock to move you out of general equilibrium. Right? But what if you're not in general equilibrium? If you're not in general equilibrium, the very first thing that you want to do is change expected inflation and shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. Even if there are other things that are happening, other shocks that are occurring in that time period, the very first thing you want to do is change inflation expectations. Shift the curve, then apply all the other shocks that might happen. Right? Now, for the other shocks, you've hopefully identified them and you've highlighted them, you know what they are, you know what they're going to cause. Do them in order that they're in the question. Right? So however I write the question, however I reveal whatever shocks occur, it's always best change expected inflation first if need be, and then do the shocks in the way that the question is written. If you do that, I don't want to say you'll never go wrong. I'll just say you'll never go wrong on one of my questions. Okay. Now, there's been some confusion about long-run aggregate supply shocks and what happens to the short-run aggregate supply curve. And part of the confusion is my fault, and I take full responsibility for it. And the reason that it's my fault is because, as you're probably aware, adaptive expectations for inflation is a very, very simple way of thinking about how inflation expectations get set. It's not actually the way I think about inflation expectations in my own work. So it turns out in the past, not last spring, but in the past, I was showing the class one way of doing it, my way, and then I realized I didn't realize it. I had a student show me what I was doing was not consistent with adaptive expectations. We're using adaptive expectations, so this is the way it will happen. Let's suppose we have a positive long-run aggregate supply shock. Right? So we've shifted this guy out. Now, what we want to ask ourselves, we know already when there's a long-run aggregate supply shock, the short-run curve will also shift. We just have to know where does it shift to. And it turns out it's very easy. At the expected inflation rate, notice pi naught, that tells us where we're going to shift to. It will shift precisely to that point. And one easy way to think about that, or see why that must be the case, is if we look at our equation for the short-run aggregate supply curve, we don't really need our price shock term. We know that in general equilibrium, long-run equilibrium, when we're on our long-run aggregate supply curve, actual inflation must equal expected inflation. So that means pi t has to equal pi t minus 1. The only place that occurs, then, is when the output gap is 0. We just changed potential output. So for the output gap to be 0, we've got to be on this new long-run aggregate supply curve. So expected inflation on this curve is still pi naught. Now remember, that doesn't tell us where we are. We still need an aggregate demand curve. But with adaptive expectations, we know exactly how far the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift. Again, if you see some old problem sets or exams, you may see that it didn't shift to that point, but you will need to do that to get full credit. Even if you copy my answer, it won't be right. That's why I'm still teaching this class. I haven't gotten it right yet. They keep making me repeat. What I'm saying is when the long-run aggregate supply curve shifts, the short-run aggregate supply curve will always shift to intersect the new long-run aggregate supply curve at the expected inflation rate, which in this case was pi naught. No, it's not a price shock. It's a change in potential output. So the change in potential output is causing both the long-run shock, or whatever event is causing the long-run curve to shift, is also the same event that's causing the short-run curve to shift.
There are circumstances where the long-run aggregate supply shifts and the short-run doesn't at all?
No, not in the model the way we've set it up so far. The short-run aggregate supply curve will always shift to intersect the new long-run aggregate supply curve at the expected inflation rate, whatever that is. Okay. We didn't get to that. Okay, just one final thing. GSIs do have review sessions set up on Friday, Sunday, and Monday. I would recommend that you take advantage of them. Study hard this weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday.